Three Soviet soldiers emerged from an Afghan cave system in 1982. Military records show they were missing for 5 days. But according to their watches, they had been gone for 5 months. According to their minds, they had never left the cave at all. This is their story pieced together from classified Soviet documents that reveal how these men encountered something in the darkness that defies human comprehension. Something ancient that exists between moments of time, watching us through mirrors, waiting for an invitation to enter our world. Something that can wear human faces. The military classified their testimony as stress-induced hallucination. But if that's true, why did all 3 men commit suicide within a year of their return? And why did the symbol found carved into their palms match cave paintings discovered across 3 continents, some dating back 30,000 years? What follows is the complete account of what happened to those soldiers. Afghanistan, Paktia Province, December 1982. Captain Mikhail Volkov squinted against the harsh mountain wind, his weathered face impassive as he surveyed the jagged terrain before him. The Hindu Kush Mountains stretched into infinity, their snow-capped peaks piercing a steel-gray sky. His breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the biting cold. "Beautiful country," Lieutenant Baranov said, coming to stand beside him. "Shame we have to die in it." Volkov shot him a sidelong glance. "Save the fatalism for your poetry, Nikolai." 8 men huddled around the BTR-60 armored personnel carrier, checking their Kalashnikovs and equipment with mechanical precision. Veterans all, transferred from different units across the 40th Army. Specialists. The kind of men you sent when others didn't come back. And others hadn't come back. 3 reconnaissance teams in the past month. 17 men total. No bodies recovered. No distress signals. Just silence. Captain Sergeant Igor Kuznetsov approached, map in hand. "We're 5 kilometers from the target area. Vehicle can't make it past this point." Volkov nodded. Kuznetsov was built like a Siberian bear, with a thick beard that defied regulations and a voice that rumbled like distant artillery. The man had fought in every shithole the Soviet Union had deemed worthy of its attention in the past decade. "We move on foot from here," Volkov announced. "Standard formation." Ivanov on point. Private Ivanov, the youngest at 22 but with eyes far older, nodded silently. The team's tracker had an almost supernatural ability to spot tripwires and pressure plates. Something else. Captain Kuznetsov's voice dropped lower. The driver heard something from the Afghans in the last village. About the caves. Volkov sighed. "Let me guess. Demons. Ghosts. They call it Shaitan Kar," Kuznetsov said, unsmiling. "The devil's hole. Even the Mujahideen avoid it. They say those who enter never return." "How convenient," Volkov replied dryly. "A perfect place to stage ambushes." Lieutenant Baranov shifted uncomfortably. "The locals seemed genuinely terrified, sir. Not just the usual hostility." "The mission parameters haven't changed," Volkov said firmly. "Command wants to know what happened to our men. If the rebels are using these caves as a base, we flush them out. If our men are being held there, we get them back." "And if it's something else?" Kuznetsov asked. Volkov didn't answer. He checked his watch instead. 1300 hours. "We move now. I want to reach the cave entrance before nightfall." The squad formed up with practiced efficiency. Ivanov took point, followed by Radioman Petrov with his bulky R-126 set. Medic Sokolov stayed near the center, flanked by machine gunner Leonov and his assistant Morozov. Demolitions expert Popov, Lieutenant Baranov, and Sergeant Kuznetsov formed the middle, with Captain Volkov taking the rear position to oversee the column. The march was grueling. The mountain paths were treacherous, narrow goat trails that hugged sheer cliff faces, loose scree that threatened to send a man tumbling into ravines hundreds of meters deep. The weight of their packs and ammunition seemed to double with each passing hour. Yet it was the silence that unnerved them most. No birds, Ivanov noted after 3 hours of hiking. No animals at all. He was right. The mountains were eerily quiet. No hawks circled overhead. No mountain goats scrambled across the slopes. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving only the sound of their boots on stone and their increasingly labored breathing. Could be the weather, Sokolov offered, though he didn't sound convinced. By late afternoon, they approached a narrow valley between 2 steep ridges. According to their maps, the cave system should be visible just beyond. Hold! Ivanov raised his fist suddenly. dropping to one knee. The column froze instantly. "Movement?" Volkov asked, voice barely above a whisper. Ivanov shook his head. Something feels wrong." Volkov was about to reprimand him for the vagueness when he felt it too. A strange pressure in his ears, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. The hairs on his arms stood on end beneath his uniform. "Radio check," he ordered. Petrov fiddled with the dials on his set, frowning. "Nothing but static, Captain. Can't reach base camp." "Mountains could be blocking the signal," Baranov suggested. "Never had problems in this region," before Petrov countered. "It's like something's jamming us." Volkov made a quick decision. "We continue to the objective. If communications don't improve, we'll send runners back to the BTR." They proceeded more cautiously now, weapons at the ready. The valley narrowed further until they were walking single file between towering rock faces. The weak winter sun barely penetrated here, casting everything in a twilight gloom. Then they saw it. The cave entrance was massive, at least 15 meters high and twice as wide. A perfect arch, as though carved by some ancient giant rather than formed by natural processes. The rock around it was darker than the surrounding stone, almost black, with strange striations that caught what little light remained in unsettling ways. "Jesus," breathed Lonov. "It's huge." "No signs of habitation," Ivanov reported, studying the ground. "No footprints, no campfire remains, nothing." "What about our missing patrols?" Baranov asked. "Nothing," Ivanov repeated. "If they came this way, they left no trace." Volkov approached the entrance, fighting an irrational urge to turn back. 20 years in the Red Army, from Czechoslovakia to Angola, and he'd never felt such instinctive dread. "Flashlights," he ordered, his voice sounding hollow even to his own ears. 8 beams cut through the darkness, revealing a smooth tunnel that descended gently into the earth. Too smooth. The walls seemed almost polished. "This isn't natural," Popov said, running a hand along the surface. "No tool marks either. This isn't man-made." "Water erosion," suggested Sokolov. Popov shook his head. "Not like any I've ever seen." Captain Petrov called. "Radio's completely dead now." A cold breeze emerged from the cave mouth, carrying a scent that none of them could identify, metallic yet organic, like blood mixed with ozone. "Form up," Volkov ordered. "Standard cave exploration protocol. Ivanov, take point with Leonov. 5-meter spacing. Report anything unusual immediately." As they prepared to enter, Kuznetsov moved beside Volkov. "Captain," he said quietly, "my grandmother was from the old country, believed in things. She would say this place has a bad spirit." "We're Soviet soldiers," Sergeant Volkov replied. "We don't believe in spirits." Kuznetsov's expression remained grave. "With respect, Captain, what we believe may not matter to whatever is in there." Volkov had no answer for that. Instead, he gave the order to advance. The squad stepped into the darkness, flashlight beams cutting through the gloom. The temperature dropped noticeably. Volkov felt a strange static charge in the air, like the moment before lightning strikes. Their boots echoed on the smooth stone floor, the sound somehow wrong, as if the acoustics defied normal physics. 5 meters in, Petrov's radio crackled suddenly to life, emitting a high-pitched whine that made them all wince. Through the static came what sounded like voices, not Russian, not Dari or Pashto, but something else entirely, syllables that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. Then silence again. "Men." "What the fuck was that?" Morozov whispered. No one answered. No one had to. They all knew, without saying it aloud, that they had just crossed a threshold, that whatever had happened to the men before them was about to happen to them too. And still, they descended into the dark. The descent. The beam of Volkov's flashlight cut through the darkness like a knife, revealing only more darkness beyond. The squad had been descending for 20 minutes, the tunnel maintaining its unnatural smoothness and perfect arch. No stalactites, no mineral deposits, no variations in the rock. Just that same polished black stone that seemed to swallow light, rather than reflect it. Temperatures dropping, Sokolov noted, his breath now forming visible clouds. Must be close to freezing. "We're not deep enough for that kind of temperature change," Popov said. The demolitions expert had studied geology before joining the army. "Not unless there's an underground glacier." "Check your watches," Volkov ordered suddenly, a suspicion forming. The men compared timepieces. confusion spreading across their faces. "Mine's running backward," Leonov said, tapping the glass face of his watch. "Mine stopped completely," added Baranov. Volkov's own watch was still functioning, but the second hand jerked erratically, sometimes freezing for several seconds before jumping ahead. "Magnetic anomaly," Petrov suggested. "Could explain the radio interference too." "Let's keep moving," Volkov said, pushing aside his unease. "Mark the walls every 20 meters. Popov took out a piece of chalk, drawing a large arrow pointing back toward the entrance. The white mark stood out starkly against the black stone. They continued downward, the tunnel now beginning to curve slightly to the left. The incline remained gentle, but Volkov estimated they descended at least 100 meters from the entrance. The air grew colder still, and strangely dense, as if they were breathing something more substantial than air. Captain Ivanov called from the front of the column. "There's something ahead." The tunnel widened suddenly into a vast chamber, so large their flashlights couldn't reach the far walls or ceiling. The floor leveled out, smooth as polished marble. And there, in the center of the visible area, was a perfect circle of what appeared to be metal, approximately 3 meters in diameter, embedded in the stone. "Spread out," Volkov ordered. "Secure the perimeter." The men moved cautiously, flashlight beams sweeping the darkness. As they advanced, more details of the chamber emerged. The walls, when finally revealed, were covered in symbols, intricate patterns that seemed to shift slightly when not looked at directly. Sir Popov called, his voice tight with controlled fear. "These markings, they're glowing." He was right. The symbols emitted a faint phosphorescence, a pale blue-green light that seemed to pulse with a rhythm reminiscent of a heartbeat. Slow, deliberate, alive. "Don't touch anything," Volkov commanded. Too late. Morozov had already placed his hand on one of the symbols, drawn to it like a moth to flame. "It's warm," he said, sounding surprised. "And I can feel it moving under my fingers." Morozov. "Step back now," Volkov barked. The young soldier withdrew his hand reluctantly. "Did you hear that?" "They're whispering." "Who's whispering?" Baranov demanded, moving closer to Morozov. "There's nobody here but us." "The walls," Morozov said simply, his eyes wide and unfocused. "They're talking to me." Before anyone could respond, a low humming began to emanate from the metal circle in the floor. It started almost imperceptibly but quickly grew in intensity, vibrating through their boots. "Fall back to the tunnel," Volkov ordered. As they retreated, Ivanov suddenly froze, staring into the darkness beyond their light. "There's something moving out there," he whispered. All flashlights swung in the direction he was pointing, but revealed nothing but empty space. "I saw it too," Leonov confirmed, his voice shaking slightly. "Just at the edge of the light, like a shadow, but wrong somehow." "Tricks of the light," Volkov said firmly, though he didn't believe it himself. "Optical illusions caused by stress and this unusual environment." The humming from the metal circle intensified, now accompanied by a soft blue glow emanating from what they could now see were intricate patterns etched into its surface. Sir Petrov said, "The radio." The communication device was picking up something again, not static this time, but what sounded like Russian voices, distorted and overlapping, speaking too quickly to make out individual words. "Could be our missing patrols," Baranov suggested hopefully. Kuznetsov shook his head. "That doesn't sound like radio communication. That sounds like what Volkov pressed when the sergeant didn't continue. Like recordings of the dead." Kuznetsov finished, crossing himself quickly despite years of communist indoctrination. "Enough," Volkov snapped. "We're here to find our missing men, not chase ghosts." Ivanov, Leonov, scout ahead, see if there are other chambers or tunnels leading off this one. Popov, examine that metal circle, but don't touch it. The rest of you, establish a perimeter. As the men moved to follow orders, Morozov suddenly stiffened. "They're coming," he said, his voice oddly flat. "Who's coming?" Volkov demanded. "The ones who've always been here," Morozov replied, his eyes now fixed on the ceiling. "The ones who were here before." Before anyone could question him further, Ivanov called out from 20 meters ahead. "Captain, I've found something." Volkov and Baranov moved quickly to join him, leaving the others to watch Morozov, who seemed to have slipped into a trance-like state. Ivanov stood before what appeared to be an alcove carved into the wall. Inside, neatly arranged, were Soviet military equipment helmets, canteens, ammunition pouches, and 3 Alaska 74s leaning against the wall. These belonged to the missing patrol, Baranov confirmed, examining a name scratched into one of the canteens. Stepanovich. He was with the second team. "Where are the men?" Volkov asked, scanning the area with his flashlight. Sir Ivanov's voice was barely audible. "Look at the wall behind the equipment." Volkov directed his beam where Ivanov pointed. What he had initially taken for more symbols was actually writing in Russian, scratched crudely into the stone. "They are in the walls. They watch from between moments. Do not listen to the voices." Below this was another message in different handwriting. "Time wrong here. Been 3 days, but watch says 3 hours. Yakov disappeared, just gone." And finally, in shaky, desperate strokes, "They retaking us one by one. Cannot find exit. Tunnel keeps changing. God forgive me for what I've seen." Volkov felt ice form in his stomach. "Get the others. We're leaving. Now." They rushed back to the main chamber only to find chaos. Morozov was gone. The remaining men were frantically searching the area with their flashlights. "What happened?" Volkov demanded. "He just vanished," Sir Sokolov reported, face pale. "We were watching him. He took 3 steps toward that metal circle, and then it was like he stepped behind an invisible curtain. Just gone." "His equipment's still here," Petrov added, pointing to Morozov's pack and rifle lying on the ground where he'd dropped them. "Form up," Volkov ordered. "We're returning to the surface immediately." Captain Kuznetsov said quietly, "The tunnel we came through, it's gone." Volkov spun around. Where the passage had been was now only solid wall, the same black stone as the rest of the chamber, unmarked by Popov's chalk arrow. "That's impossible," Baranov whispered. "Spread out," Volkov commanded, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Find another way out. There has to be another tunnel." The men moved in pairs, searching the perimeter of the chamber. Volkov checked his watch again. The hands were now spinning rapidly in reverse. Sir Leonov called from the far side. "We've found another passage." Hope surged briefly until Volkov reached them. The new tunnel was identical to the one they'd entered through, same dimensions, same smooth walls, same gentle slope leading downward. "This wasn't here before," Popov insisted. "We checked this entire wall earlier." "Could we have gotten turned around?" Baranov suggested. "Lost our orientation." "Not possible," Kuznetsov said firmly. "I've been keeping track of our position. This is exactly where we came in, but the tunnel is different." A sudden scream echoed through the chamber. Petrov, who had wandered a few meters away, was backing up in terror, his flashlight beam fixed on something on the wall. "It moved," he shouted. They all turned to look. One of the glowing patterns was indeed changing, flowing like liquid across the stone surface, reforming into a shape that looked disturbingly like a human face contorted in agony. "We need to move," Volkov decided. "This new tunnel is our only option. It's leading deeper, not out," Ivanov pointed out. "Then we find another way once we're clear of this chamber," Volkov replied. "Mark the entrance. Double marks this time." Popov made 2 large chalk X's beside the tunnel entrance. As they watched, the marks seemed to sink into the stone, fading slightly before stabilizing. "Move out," Volkov ordered. "Ivanov, take point again. Leonov, bring up the rear. Everyone stays within visual contact at all times." They entered the new tunnel, the hum from the metal circle growing fainter behind them. The passage descended more steeply than the previous one, curving gently to the right. After walking for what seemed like 10 minutes, Ivanov stopped abruptly. "Captain," he called back. "The tunnel splits ahead." Volkov moved forward to see. The passage indeed forked into 3 identical tunnels, each continuing downward at the same angle. "Popov, mark this junction," Volkov ordered. "We'll take the center path." As Popov moved to mark the wall, Leonov called from the rear. "Sir, Ivanov is gone." What? Volkov spun around. "He was just here." "He walked ahead to check the center tunnel," Leonov explained, panic edging into his voice. "He was only 5 meters ahead of me. I looked down to check my magazine for 1 second, and when I looked up." The remaining 6 men clustered together, flashlight beams probing the darkness ahead. There was no sign of Ivanov. "Ivanov," Volkov called out. "Report," only silence answered. "He can't have gone far," Baranov said. "The tunnel is straight ahead." "Leonov, How long was he out of your sight? Volkov asked. 1 second, sir. 2 at most. Impossible, Sokolov muttered. No one can move that fast. Unless Popov hesitated. Unless time is different here. Remember our watches. As if to emphasize his point, a voice called from far ahead, Ivanov's voice, but distant, as if from hundreds of meters away. Captain, where are you? I've been searching for almost an hour. The men exchanged horrified glances. Stay together, Volkov ordered. We moved forward as a group. They advanced cautiously, calling out to Ivanov. His replies came sporadically, sometimes sounding close, sometimes impossibly far away. After 5 minutes of careful progress, they reached another chamber, smaller than the first, but with the same smooth walls covered in glowing symbols. Ivanov stood in the center, his back to them. Thank God, Baranov breathed. Ivanov, we're here. Ivanov turned slowly. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with terror. Captain, he said, his voice trembling. I've been here for hours. I thought you'd abandoned me. It's been less than 10 minutes since you disappeared, Volkov told him. Ivanov shook his head violently. No, that's not possible. I've been walking for hours. The tunnels. They keep changing. Every time I thought I was getting back to you, I'd find myself somewhere new. He's right, Sir Petrov said suddenly, examining his watch. According to this, 3 hours have passed since we entered the cave. That can't be right, Volkov insisted, though doubt crept into his voice. We've been inside for 40 minutes at most. Time isn't working right here, Kuznetsov said grimly. Just like the message said. A low rumble suddenly shook the chamber, dust and small stones raining down from above. What was that? Sokolov asked. An earthquake. No, Ivanov whispered, looking up with renewed terror. They're coming. I saw them. While I was lost, they live in the spaces between moments. They're coming for all of us. Who's coming? Volkov demanded, grabbing Ivanov by the shoulders. What did you see? Ivanov's eyes met his, filled with a horror that chilled Volkov to his core. I don't know what they are, Ivanov said, but they've been taking people for thousands of years. And we're next. As if in response to his words, the symbols on the walls began to pulse more rapidly, their glow intensifying. The rumbling grew louder, and a wind that shouldn't exist underground began to swirl around them, carrying whispers in a language none of them recognized. We need to leave, Volkov stated, the authority in his voice belying his growing fear. Now. But which way? Baranov asked, gesturing to the multiple tunnels that now opened from the chamber, none of which they had entered through. They're all different. Volkov made a rapid decision. We split up. 2 teams, 3 tunnels each. First team to find a way out signals the others. With respect, Captain Kuznetsov objected. Splitting up seems like exactly what this place wants us to do. Before Volkov could respond, a scream tore through the chamber, Petrov this time, pointing at the wall behind them. The symbols were flowing together, coalescing into a shape that unmistakably resembled a doorway. And something was coming through. Run, Volkov shouted. Any tunnel. As the men scrambled toward the nearest passages, Volkov looked back one last time. What he saw in that moment would haunt him forever, if forever still had any meaning in this place where time itself had become unmoored. The last thing he heard before plunging into darkness was Baranov's voice, suddenly cut short. My God. They're already here. Captain Volkov's breath caught in his throat as he watched the doorway of symbols pulse with an eerie light. Through it emerged not a solid form, but a distortion, a rippling in the air that bent light around it like heat rising from asphalt. The outline suggested something vaguely humanoid, but with proportions that shifted and flowed, never settling into a recognizable shape. Fall back, Volkov ordered, his voice echoing unnaturally in the chamber. The squad stumbled backward, weapons trained on the doorway, as the distortion vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only a lingering afterimage burned into their retinas. What did you see? Volkov demanded of Baranov, whose face had gone ashen. I don't, Baranov stammered, his usual composure shattered. It wasn't anything that should exist. Kuznetsov checked his Alaska 74, hands steady but eyes betraying his fear. Captain, we need to get out. Now. Volkov nodded grimly. Where's Ivanov? Here came a weak voice from behind a rock formation. The tracker emerged, face drawn and pale. Radio's completely dead now, not even static. Before them stretched 3 identical tunnels, each carved with the same unnatural precision. The entrance they'd used to enter the chamber had simply ceased to exist, replaced by a smooth wall as if it had never been there at all. "We have no choice," Volkov said, studying the 3 passages. "We split up. 3 teams. Each takes a tunnel. First team to find a way out signals with a flare." "Split up? Are you insane?" Petrov hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever's in here is picking us off." "You have a better suggestion?" Private Volkov's voice hardened. "We can sit here and wait for that thing to return, or we can try to find a way out." Silence fell as the reality of their situation sank in. "I'll take Tunnel 1," Volkov decided. "Ivanov and Sokolov with me. Baranov, you take Petrov and Popov down Tunnel 2. Kuznetsov, you're with Leonov in Tunnel 3. Baranov checked his magazine nervously. "How long do we go before turning back?" 1 hour. "Then we return to this junction," Volkov said, though his watch had stopped functioning entirely. "Mark the walls as you go, and stay alert." The teams separated reluctantly, each disappearing into the gaping maws of the 3 identical passages. Volkov led his team cautiously, the beam of his flashlight revealing the same smooth, unnatural walls. Sokolov used his combat knife to scratch marks every few meters, rough arrows pointing back the way they'd come. 20 minutes into their exploration, Volkov stopped abruptly. "What is it?" Captain Ivanov whispered. Volkov's flashlight illuminated one of Sokolov's arrow markings on the wall ahead of them. "We've been walking in a straight line. How is that possible?" Ivanov touched the blood on Fedorov's uniform. "This blood isn't even fully dried." Volkov examined the corpse more carefully. Fedorov's throat had been torn open, but not by any weapon Volkov recognized. The wound edges were cauterized, as if burned. "His watch is still running," Sokolov noted, pointing to Fedorov's wrist. The second hand moved steadily, counting out time that no longer had meaning in this place. "Check the date," Volkov ordered. Sokolov examined the watch's tiny date display. April 17th. "That's 4 months from now." A faint scratching sound interrupted him. All 3 men froze, weapons raised. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate scraping against stone, like claws or fingernails dragging across the walls. "There," Ivanov whispered, pointing his flashlight down the tunnel. For a split second, the beam caught something moving, a dark, fluid shape that seemed to fold itself into the wall. It left behind a glistening trail, like wet ink on the stone. "I don't know," Volkov admitted, "but we're not alone down here." The radio crackled again. This time it was Baranov's voice, clear and urgent. "Captain, we found something. A chamber. It's filled with mirrors, but they're wrong somehow. We need you to." His voice dissolved into static. "Baranov. Repeat your last," Volkov demanded. The static cleared momentarily, coming back through the mirrors. "Popov," is the transmission cut off with a sound like breaking glass. "We need to find them," Volkov decided. "Back to the junction." They turned around, following Sokolov's markings back the way they'd come. But after 10 minutes of walking, Volkov realized something was wrong. The markings were becoming less frequent, then stopped altogether. "We should have reached the junction by now," Sokolov said, sweeping his flashlight across the unmarked walls. "The tunnel's changed," Ivanov whispered. "It's hurting us." A sound echoed from somewhere ahead, a wet, tearing noise followed by something heavy hitting stone. The 3 men broke into a run, weapons ready. The tunnel curved sharply, opening into a vast space. As they entered, Volkov's flashlight beam caught a glimpse of movement, dark shapes withdrawing into crevices that hadn't been there seconds before. "Baranov!" Volkov shouted, firing a burst from his Alaska 74. The bullets sparked against the stone walls, but the shapes had already vanished, leaving behind only a smear of blood on the floor and a torn piece of Soviet uniform fabric. "Captain," Sokolov said, his voice trembling, "look up." Volkov raised his flashlight. The beam illuminated what appeared to be a cathedral-like chamber with a high, vaulted ceiling. But instead of stone, the ceiling was composed of what looked like human bodies, dozens of them, fused together and embedded in the rock. Some wore tattered Soviet uniforms, others the clothing of Afghan mujahideen, and still others wore garments Volkov didn't recognize, military attire from different eras, different nations. and they were moving. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, but moving nonetheless, a finger twitching here, an eyelid fluttering there. My God, Ivanov breathed, crossing himself. Are they alive? Sokolov whispered. As if in answer, one of the bodies turned its head slightly, its milky eyes focusing on them. Its mouth opened, but no sound emerged, only a trickle of black fluid that ran down the wall. We need to keep moving, Volkov said, tearing his gaze away from the horror above. Now. They hurried across the chamber, trying not to look up at the ceiling of fused bodies. At the far side, they found 3 new tunnels leading away from the chamber. Which one? Sokolov asked. Before Volkov could answer, they heard a soft, rhythmic whispering coming from the central tunnel. Words in a language none of them recognized, but which somehow conveyed meaning nonetheless. We see you, time-bound ones. We have always seen you. We will wear your moments. Not that one, Volkov said, pointing to the left tunnel instead. This way. They moved quickly, the whispering growing fainter behind them. The new tunnel sloped upward, giving them hope that they might be heading toward the surface. After several minutes of climbing, the passage widened into another chamber, smaller than the last. In the center stood Baranov. Thank God, Sokolov breathed. Lieutenant, are you all right? Where's Popov? Baranov didn't respond. He stood perfectly still, facing away from them. Baranov, Volkov called, approaching cautiously. Report. Slowly, Baranov turned. His face was expressionless, his eyes vacant. Blood stained his uniform, but he showed no signs of injury. They're in the mirrors, he said, his voice flat and monotonous. They've always been in the mirrors. Who's in the mirrors? Volkov asked, keeping his distance. Something was wrong with Baranov, his movements too stiff, his voice too hollow. The Watchers, Baranov replied. They've been waiting, studying, learning how to wear us. Ivanov backed away slightly. Captain, he whispered, something's wrong with him. Volkov nodded imperceptibly. Baranov, do you remember the coordinates of our extraction point? A flicker of confusion crossed Baranov's face. Then his expression smoothed out again. Extraction is no longer necessary. We are where we belong. That's not Baranov, Sokolov muttered, raising his weapon. No, said the thing wearing Baranov's face, its voice now carrying an undercurrent of something else, like multiple voices speaking in perfect unison. Not anymore. Baranov's face began to change, the skin rippling like the surface of disturbed water. His features blurred, then reformed into something that approximated a human face but wasn't quite right, the proportions slightly off, the eyes too large and too dark. What have you done with our men? Volkov demanded, his Alaska 74 trained on the creature. They serve a greater purpose now, the thing said, gesturing upward with a hand that bent at impossible angles. As you will. Volkov fired a burst into the creature's chest. Instead of blood, the wounds leaked a black, viscous fluid that moved with apparent intelligence, flowing back into the holes. Run, Volkov shouted. The 3 men scattered as the thing that wasn't Baranov lurched toward them, its movements becoming increasingly unnatural, joints bending in ways human anatomy wouldn't allow. They fled down a side passage, the creature's inhuman laughter echoing behind them. The tunnel twisted and turned, branching repeatedly. They took random paths, hoping to lose their pursuer. Eventually, they emerged into yet another chamber, this one different from the others. The walls were covered in what looked like mirrors, dozens of them, each reflecting the chamber but with subtle, disturbing differences. In one, the chamber appeared flooded with black liquid. In another, the ceiling was crawling with shadowy figures. In a third, Soviet soldiers, their missing comrades, stood frozen in poses of terror. What is this place? Ivanov whispered. I think, Volkov said grimly, they're not mirrors. They're windows. Windows to what? Sokolov asked. To other versions of this place. Other realities. As if to confirm his theory, one of the mirrors rippled, and through it stepped Popov, or something wearing Popov's form. Its movements were jerky, puppet-like, and its eyes were completely black. Captain Volkov, it said, its voice a distorted approximation of Popov's. The others are waiting for you. What others? Volkov demanded, backing away. The false Popov smiled, revealing teeth that were too numerous, too sharp. The ones who have always been here. The ones who will wear your world. More figures began to emerge from other mirrors, distorted versions of their missing comrades, each moving with the same unnatural gait. each speaking with the same multi-layered voice. "They're coming through," Sokolov gasped. "All of them." Volkov fired at the nearest mirror. The glass shattered with a sound like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. The creature that had been emerging from it collapsed into a puddle of black fluid. "The mirrors," Volkov shouted. "Destroy the mirrors." They opened fire on the reflective surfaces, each shattering mirror releasing a burst of cold, otherworldly light. The creatures shrieked a sound that pierced through bone and sanity as their gateways were destroyed. In the chaos, Volkov noticed something on the far wall, a tunnel that sloped sharply upward, with what looked like natural light filtering down from above. "There," he pointed. "That might be a way out." They fought their way toward the tunnel, shattering mirrors as they went. The creatures pursued, their forms becoming increasingly unstable, limbs elongating and faces melting and reforming. Just as they reached the tunnel entrance, the false Popov lunged at Ivanov, wrapping elongated fingers around his throat. Ivanov struggled, firing his pistol point blank into the creature's face. It recoiled, its features dissolving into a writhing mass of darkness. "Go," Volkov shouted to Sokolov. "Get up that tunnel. I'll cover you." Sokolov hesitated only briefly before scrambling up the sloping passage. Volkov fired controlled bursts at the advancing creatures, buying time for Ivanov to break free. Captain Ivanov gasped, stumbling toward him. "They're everywhere." Up the tunnel. Now, Volkov ordered, shoving Ivanov ahead of him. They clambered up the steep incline, the creatures pursuing with inhuman speed. The tunnel grew narrower, the slope steeper. Natural light grew stronger above them, sunlight filtering through what must be an opening to the surface. Behind them, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. "You cannot leave. You are already part of us. We have tasted your time." The tunnel ended in a narrow crevice, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Sokolov was already there, reaching back to help them up. "Hurry," he urged. "I can see daylight." Ivanov reached the crevice next, Volkov right behind him. As Ivanov began to squeeze through, something grabbed Volkov's ankle, a hand emerging from the solid stone of the tunnel floor, its fingers elongating to wrap around his leg. "Go," Volkov shouted, kicking at the grasping hand. "Get out." Ivanov disappeared through the crevice. Volkov fired his last rounds into the stone floor, shattering the hand that held him. He scrambled upward, forcing his body through the narrow opening. He emerged onto a rocky ledge high on the mountainside, the afternoon sun momentarily blinding him after so long in the darkness. Sokolov and Ivanov were there, gasping for breath, their faces turned toward the sky, as if they couldn't believe they were seeing it again. "Seal it," Volkov ordered, pointing to the crevice. "Use the grenades." They worked quickly, placing their remaining grenades into the narrow opening. Backing away, they detonated them, collapsing the entrance in a shower of rock and dust. For several minutes, none of them spoke. They simply stood there, breathing the clean mountain air, feeling the sun on their faces. Finally, Sokolov broke the silence. "What were those things, Captain?" Volkov stared at the sealed crevice, half expecting something to emerge despite their efforts. "They called themselves the Watchers, I think. I think they've been studying us, learning how to become us." "Why?" Ivanov asked. "To escape," Volkov said quietly. "To enter our world." They looked out over the valley below. From this height, they could see for kilometers in every direction. The landscape appeared normal, peaceful, even snow-capped mountains, verdant valleys, the distant smudge of their base camp. But something felt wrong. The colors seemed slightly off, the shadows too deep. And when Volkov looked at his watch, he found it working perfectly again, except the date now read April 17th, 4 months in the future. "We need to get back to camp," he said, not sharing this discovery with the others. "Report what happened." "Who's going to believe us?" Sokolov asked. "No one," Volkov admitted. "But we need to warn them anyway." As they began their descent, Volkov couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not from the sealed cave, but from somewhere much closer. And when he caught a glimpse of his reflection in Sokolov's canteen, he could have sworn it smiled at him before he did. The descent from the mountain was eerily silent. No birds called, no insects buzzed, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Volkov led the way, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what they'd experienced. Sokolov followed, occasionally checking his watch with growing unease. Ivanov brought up the rear, constantly looking over his shoulder as if expecting pursuit. Captain Sokolov said after nearly an hour of silence. Something's wrong with the sun. Volkov looked up. The sun hung in the western sky, but it hadn't moved since they'd emerged from the cave. It remained fixed in place, the shadows around them unnaturally still. Time, Volkov muttered. Time is still wrong. What do you mean? Ivanov asked, his voice tight with tension. Look at your watch, Volkov replied. Ivanov checked his timepiece, then frowned. The second hand is moving, but he held the watch to his ear. It's ticking at maybe 1/3 normal speed. We're still affected by whatever was in that cave, Volkov said grimly. We may have physically escaped, but we haven't fully returned to our reality. They continued downward, following a narrow goat path that wound through the rocky terrain. As they rounded a bend, Sokolov suddenly froze. Do you see that? He whispered, pointing to a flat rock face ahead of them. At first, Volkov saw nothing unusual. Then he noticed a subtle distortion in the air, like heat shimmer but more defined. As they watched, the distortion took shape, resolving into what looked like a doorway made of light. Back up, Volkov ordered. Slowly, they retreated around the bend, taking cover behind a large boulder. What the hell was that? Ivanov hissed. I think, Volkov said carefully, the Watchers are still trying to reach us. But we sealed the cave, Sokolov protested. The cave was just one entrance, Volkov replied. They said they were everywhere, watching from between moments. I think they can create doorways wherever reality is. Thin. A soft whispering reached them, carried on a wind that hadn't existed moments before. We see you, time-bound ones. Your moments are already ours. You cannot outrun what is already inside you. They're in our heads, Ivanov said, pressing his palms against his temples. How do we fight something that's in our heads? Volkov checked his weapon. 3 rounds left. Not enough to fight whatever was pursuing them. We keep moving. Stay off the main paths. Head for the base camp. They abandoned the goat trail, instead picking their way through the treacherous scree slopes and narrow ravines. The going was slow and dangerous, but at least they encountered no more doorways of light. As twilight approached, the sun finally beginning to move again. Though too quickly now, they spotted the Soviet camp in the valley below. The familiar arrangement of tents and vehicles should have been reassuring, but something about it made Volkov uneasy. No movement, he noted, studying the camp through his field binoculars. No patrols, no activity at all. Could they have been evacuated? Sokolov suggested, without taking the vehicles. Unlikely. They approached cautiously, using the gathering darkness for cover. The camp's perimeter was unguarded, the main gate standing open. No lights burned in any of the tents, and an unnatural silence hung over everything. Stay close, Volkov ordered as they slipped inside the compound. The camp appeared perfectly preserved but completely abandoned. In the mess tent, half-eaten meals sat on tables, as if the diners had simply stood up and walked away mid-bite. In the command center, maps remained pinned to boards, radios hummed with static, chairs were pushed back haphazardly. It's like everyone just vanished, Sokolov whispered. Like Morozov, Ivanov added. Just gone. Volkov moved to the communication station, adjusting dials and frequencies. This is Captain Volkov calling Kabul HQ. Emergency Protocol Alpha. Requesting immediate response. Only static answered. Try Moscow Command, Sokolov suggested. Volkov changed frequencies. This is Soviet Forward Base Vostok 4 calling Moscow Command. Code red situation. Requesting immediate response. The static shifted, resolving briefly into what sounded like voices, multiple voices overlapping, speaking too rapidly to comprehend before fading back to white noise. What was that? Ivanov asked. I don't know, Volkov admitted. But it wasn't Russian. They continued exploring the camp, searching for any clue to what had happened. In the commander's tent, Volkov found the daily logs. He flipped through the pages, his expression growing increasingly troubled. Captain Sokolov prompted. According to these reports, Volkov said slowly, we returned to base 3 days ago. That's impossible, Ivanov said. We've been in that cave until today. Look, Volkov handed him the logbook. May 4th entry reconnaissance squad Volk 7 returned at 0600 hours. 4 survivors. Captain Volkov reports mission failure. 5 men lost. 4 survivors, Sokolov counted on his fingers. There's only 3 of us here. There's more, Volkov continued reading. May 5th, Captain Volkov. Lieutenant Sokolov, and Private Ivanov behaving erratically. Medical Officer Petrov recommends psychiatric evaluation, and then May 6th, no contact from Kabul HQ for 48 hours. Radio communications failing. Captain Volkov ordered camp evacuation at 1,400 hours. This is bullshit, Ivanov hissed. We never came back here. We never reported anything. Volkov continued searching the desk until he found a sealed folder marked Eyes Only, breaking the seal. He removed several photographs. They showed the camp, bustling with activity. And there, standing near a BTR, were Volkov, Sokolov, and Ivanov, speaking with the base commander. But Volkov had no memory of this moment. That's not possible, he whispered. A sudden noise from outside broke their stunned silence. They rushed out to find the camp transformed. Where moments before there had been emptiness, now there was activity, soldiers moving between tents, vehicles being serviced, the normal bustle of military life. Except none of the soldiers noticed them. When Volkov approached a group of men working on a BTR, they continued their tasks as if he wasn't there. They can't see us, Sokolov realized. Or we can't see them, Volkov countered. Not properly. We're experiencing time differently. As they watched, the activity around them began to speed up, soldiers moving faster and faster until they became blurs. Then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The soldiers froze in place, then faded from view like ghosts, leaving the camp empty once more. What the hell is happening? Ivanov demanded, his voice cracking with stress. Before Volkov could answer, he noticed something across the compound, a figure standing perfectly still, watching them. It wore a Soviet officer's uniform, and its face. That's me, Volkov breathed. The doppelganger smiled, a cold, empty expression that never reached its eyes. Then it spoke, its voice carrying clearly across the distance. You activated the key, it said. After all this time, a human finally did what was needed. What key? Volkov demanded. What are you talking about? The plate in the chamber, the duplicate replied. The threshold between worlds. You touched it, marked yourself with our sign. It gestured to Volkov's hand. Volkov looked down. On his palm, barely visible but definitely there, was a faint pattern of lines, the same intricate symbol that had been etched into the metal plate in the cave. Who are you? Sokolov asked, his rifle trained on the duplicate. We are the Watchers, it replied, still wearing Volkov's face. We have existed alongside your reality for millennia, observing, learning. The cave you found is a junction point, a place where our world touches yours. What happened to our men? Volkov demanded. The missing patrols. They serve us now, the duplicate said simply. As all humans eventually will. More figures appeared behind it, duplicates of Sokolov and Ivanov, all watching with the same empty expressions. You're not just copying our appearances, Volkov realized. You're studying us, learning how to be us. Of course, the duplicate nodded. We must understand what we will become. A cold dread settled in Volkov's stomach. What do you mean, become? Your world, the thing said simply. We will become your world. As it spoke, the camp around them began to change. The tents rippled as if made of liquid. The ground beneath their feet became transparent in patches, revealing glimpses of the vast cave system below. The barrier between our realities is weakening, the duplicate explained. Soon, we will no longer need physical gateways like the cave. We will simply step through wherever we wish. And what happens to us? Ivanov asked. The duplicate turned its gaze to him. Some will serve as vessels, others will join the watching. It gestured upward, and for a brief moment, Volkov saw the ceiling of fused bodies from the cave superimposed over the night sky, hundreds of human figures embedded in the firmament, their eyes open and aware, silently screaming. We won't let that happen, Volkov said firmly, raising his weapon. The duplicate laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You already have. The process began the moment you touched the threshold. It cannot be stopped now. The duplicates began moving toward them with unnatural, gliding steps. Run, Volkov shouted, firing his remaining rounds at his doppelganger. The bullets passed through it as if through smoke. They fled toward the center of camp, the duplicates pursuing at a leisurely pace, as if confident in their eventual success. Inside the command tent, Volkov barricaded the entrance, knowing it was futile. What do we do now? Sokolov asked, his voice shaking. Volkov looked down at the symbol on his palm, which had begun to glow faintly. The duplicate said, I activated something. Maybe I can deactivate it. How Ivanov demanded. I don't know yet. But there must be a way. The radio suddenly crackled to life, emitting a high-pitched whine before settling into a rhythmic pattern of static. Through the noise came a voice, Volkov's own voice. Still in the chamber. Can anyone hear this? We are trapped at the lowest level. The symbols on the wall, they're moving. Something is coming through. Volkov grabbed the radio. This is Captain Volkov. Who is this? A pause, then Captain Volkov. But I'm Captain Volkov. How is this possible? We're in some kind of constructed reality, Volkov explained rapidly. But I think our physical bodies might still be in the cave. Are you with Sokolov and Ivanov? Yes, all here. We activated something, a plate in the floor with a handprint. Now the cave is changing around us. Volkov looked down at the mark on his palm. I know. Listen carefully. You need to. The radio exploded in a shower of sparks. Outside, the duplicate watchers had surrounded the tent. They don't want us communicating with ourselves, Sokolov realized. The tent walls began to ripple and distort. The duplicates were pushing through, their forms becoming smoke-like as they penetrated the fabric. Wait, Ivanov said suddenly. If our bodies are still in the cave, then what are we? How are we here? We're not, Volkov said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. This isn't real either. It's another layer of deception. The Watchers are keeping our minds trapped while they study us, learn from us. So how do we get back to our real bodies, Sokolov asked. Volkov looked at his marked palm again. The symbol was glowing brighter now, pulsing with an internal light. We need to find a mirror. A mirror, Ivanov repeated, confused. In the cave, they used mirrors as gateways between realities, Volkov explained. If this is a constructed reality, there must be a way out, a reflection of the truth. They burst from the tent, running across the compound as reality itself seemed to unravel around them. The sky flickered between day and night. Buildings appeared and disappeared. The ground beneath their feet became transparent in patches, revealing glimpses of the vast cave system below. In the commander's quarters, they found what they were looking for, a mirror, ordinary in appearance but somehow wrong. Instead of reflecting the room around them, it showed the cave chamber, where everything had begun, the metal plate in the floor, the glowing symbols on the walls. That's it, Volkov said. That's our way back. He pressed his marked palm against the glass. The surface rippled, then parted like mercury. Through it, they could see their own bodies, sitting in a circle around the metal plate, eyes closed as if in deep meditation. Go, Volkov ordered Sokolov and Ivanov. They didn't hesitate, diving through the liquid-like surface. As Volkov prepared to follow, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find himself face to face with his duplicate. You understand so little, it said, its features beginning to shift and flow. This is merely the beginning. We have waited eons for this moment. What moment? Volkov demanded. The merging of our worlds, the creature replied. The key you activated doesn't just open a door, it dissolves the barrier between realities. Even if you return to your body, you take us with you. We are in your mind now, Captain. We are in your memories, your thoughts. You will be our vessel. With a surge of desperate strength, Volkov tore free and threw himself into the mirror. As he passed through, he heard the creature's final words. We'll be waiting when you wake, Captain. We'll be wearing familiar faces. The world dissolved into darkness as Volkov fell through dimensions, the mark on his palm burning like a brand. Volkov awoke with a violent gasp, his lungs burning as if he'd been underwater too long. Cold stone pressed against his back, grounding him to reality, a reality he wasn't entirely sure was his own anymore. The chamber around him came into focus slowly, the same chamber where they'd found the metal plate, where everything had started to fall apart. Captain Sokolov's voice, hoarse and uncertain, came from nearby. Volkov tried to sit up, his muscles protesting as if they hadn't been used in days. His head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. I'm here, he managed. Sokolov was already on his feet, swaying slightly, eyes darting around the chamber with frantic energy. We're back. How did we? He stopped mid-sentence, staring at his hands as if he didn't recognize them. Where's Ivanov? Volkov asked, pressing his palm against his temple. The symbol on his other hand pulsed with a faint glow, sending ripples of discomfort up his arm. Here came a weak voice from the shadows. Ivanov emerged, his face gaunt, eyes haunted. Did that really happen? The camp, the duplicates. I think so, Volkov said, struggling to his feet. But I'm not sure what's real anymore. The chamber looked the same as when they'd first discovered it, the metal plate embedded in the floor, the strange symbols etched into the walls. But something felt subtly wrong, as if the proportions had shifted by millimeters. The air smelled different, too stale, with an undertone of something metallic. Check your watches, Volkov ordered, glancing at his own. The second hand ticked steadily, mockingly normal. But the date. May 11th, Sokolov whispered, confirming what Volkov was seeing. We've lost almost 5 months. That's impossible, Ivanov muttered, but the conviction in his voice had long since eroded. Nothing was impossible anymore. Volkov surveyed the chamber. Their equipment lay scattered where they'd dropped it, packs, weapons, supplies, but there was no sign of the rest of their squad. Where are the others? Sokolov asked, voicing Volkov's thoughts. As if in answer, their flashlights revealed what the shadows had been hiding: bodies, or what appeared to be bodies. Kuznetsov lay slumped against the far wall, his form strangely distorted, as if partially melted into the stone. Leonov was nearby, his body twisted at impossible angles, face frozen in a silent scream. Popov, Morozov, Petrov, all present, all wrong somehow. Are they dead? Ivanov whispered. Volkov approached Kuznetsov cautiously. The sergeant's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, but his eyes were open and unseeing, staring at nothing. Not dead, Volkov said grimly. Something worse. He examined the others and found them in similar states, alive but unresponsive, their bodies partially merged with the stone floor or walls. It was as if they were being slowly absorbed by the cave itself. We need to get them out, Sokolov said, moving to Leonov's side. Don't touch them, Volkov warned. We don't know what's happening to them. It could be contagious. Sokolov backed away reluctantly. We can't just leave them. We won't, Volkov assured him. But first we need to understand what's happening. And we need to find a way out. They gathered their remaining equipment, taking inventory of what they had left. 3 Alaska 74s with limited ammunition. 1 radio, still functioning but picking up nothing but static. Food and water for maybe 2 days. Medical supplies. The tunnel we came in through, Ivanov suggested, pointing to what should have been their entrance point. But where the passage had been was now only solid wall, the same black stone as the rest of the chamber. That's impossible, Sokolov whispered. Search the perimeter, Volkov ordered. There has to be another way out. They moved methodically around the chamber, examining every section of wall. After several minutes, Ivanov called out from the far side. Captain, I found something. Volkov and Sokolov joined him quickly. Ivanov stood before what appeared to be a narrow crevice in the wall, barely visible, unless you knew exactly where to look. It's not much, Ivanov admitted, but I can feel air moving through it. There's something on the other side. Volkov examined the opening. It was tight, but a man could squeeze through if he removed his equipment first. Good work, Private. I'll go first, then you two follow with the gear. He removed his pack and weapon, handing them to Sokolov. Taking a deep breath, he began to edge sideways into the narrow gap. The stone scraped against his chest and back, but he could indeed feel a faint breeze coming from somewhere ahead. After several claustrophobic minutes of inching forward, the crevice widened enough for Volkov to move more freely. A few more steps and he emerged into another chamber. This one dimly illuminated by a strange, phosphorescent fungus growing on the walls. It's clear, he called back. Come through. Sokolov and Ivanov joined him shortly, bringing their equipment. The new chamber was smaller than the first, but similarly constructed, smooth walls covered in symbols, a floor of polished black stone. But instead of a metal plate, the center of this room contained what appeared to be a pool of still, black liquid. What is that? Sokolov asked, approaching cautiously. Don't touch it, Volkov warned, studying the pool from a safe distance. The liquid was perfectly still, its surface reflecting the chamber like a mirror. But as Volkov watched, the reflection began to change, showing not the chamber they stood in, but somewhere else entirely: a snow-covered landscape, mountains in the distance, a Soviet military outpost. It's our base camp, Ivanov realized. But it's winter there. How is that possible? Time distortion, Volkov suggested. Like our watches. Maybe this pool shows different times, different places. As they watched, the image in the pool shifted again, now showing the same base camp but abandoned, equipment scattered as if the occupants had left in a hurry. Then, it changed once more, the camp in ruins, overgrown with vegetation, years or decades abandoned. "It's showing us possibilities," Sokolov said quietly. "Different futures. Or different pasts," Volkov countered. "We don't know what's real anymore." The image in the pool stabilized, now showing their current base camp as they remembered it, tents arranged in neat rows, soldiers going about their duties. But there was something off about the scene. The movements of the men were too precise, too uniform. And when one soldier turned toward the viewpoint, his face was blank, literally blank, with no features at all. "They're not real," Ivanov whispered. "None of it is real." A soft whispering began to fill the chamber, emanating not from any specific source but from the air itself. "We see through many eyes. We walk through many doors. We wear many faces. Soon we will wear yours." "The Watchers," Volkov said grimly. "They're still here." The liquid in the pool began to ripple, small waves spreading outward from the center. Something was rising from the depths, a hand, human in shape but wrong somehow. The fingers too long, the joints too numerous. "Back to the crevice," Volkov ordered. "Now." They retreated quickly, but when they reached the narrow opening, they found it sealed solid stone where the gap had been moments before. "It's gone," Sokolov exclaimed, running his hands over the smooth wall. "How is that possible?" "The cave is changing," Volkov said, "reshaping itself around us." More hands were emerging from the pool now, reaching upward like drowning victims seeking rescue. But these were no victims. As the first figure pulled itself free of the liquid, they saw it clearly, a humanoid form composed of what looked like black glass, its surface constantly shifting and flowing, reflecting distorted images of themselves. "What do we do?" Ivanov asked, his voice tight with fear. Volkov scanned the chamber desperately. There had to be another way out. His gaze fell on the symbols etched into the walls, similar to those in the first chamber, but arranged differently, and among them, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for, was the same mark that had appeared on his palm. Acting on instinct, Volkov pressed his marked hand against the matching symbol on the wall. The contact sent a jolt of energy through him, like electricity but colder, reaching deep into his core. The symbol began to glow, spreading outward to illuminate the surrounding patterns. The wall beneath his hand shimmered, then seemed to dissolve, revealing a tunnel beyond, rough-hewn, natural-looking, sloping upward. "Through here," Volkov shouted, already moving into the new passage. Sokolov and Ivanov followed quickly, not daring to look back at the creatures emerging from the pool. They scrambled up the tunnel, which was steep but manageable, the stone rough enough to provide good handholds. After climbing for what felt like hours, they emerged onto a narrow ledge high on the mountainside. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the valley below. The air was clean and cold, filling their lungs with a sweetness that made them dizzy after so long underground. "We made it," Sokolov breathed, sinking to his knees in exhaustion. But Volkov wasn't convinced. He studied their surroundings carefully. The mountains looked right, the valley below matched his memory of the area. But the sun, it was rising in the west, not the east. "This isn't right," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" Ivanov asked. "Look at the sun," Volkov pointed. "It's in the wrong place." As they watched, the sun began to move across the sky at an accelerated rate, completing what should have been a day's journey in minutes. Then it reversed direction, tracking backward to its starting position before repeating the cycle. "We're still inside," Sokolov realized, his voice hollow with despair. "This is just another illusion." "No," Volkov countered. "Not an illusion. I think we're in a boundary space somewhere between our world and theirs, a place where the rules of reality are flexible." "So how do we get back to our world?" Ivanov asked. "The real world." Before Volkov could answer, a voice spoke from behind them, a voice that was disturbingly familiar. "You don't." They spun around to find themselves face to face with duplicates, perfect copies of themselves, down to the dirt smudges on their uniforms and the expressions of weary exhaustion on their faces. "What are you?" Volkov demanded of his doppelganger. "We are what comes next," the duplicate replied, its voice a perfect mimicry of Volkov's own, but with an undercurrent of something else, a resonance that made the air vibrate. "We are the evolution of your form." "Your watchers," Sokolov said, backing away from his own double. "We were the duplicate," Sokolov acknowledged. "Now we are becoming you." The duplicates began to change, their forms rippling like disturbed water. Their features blurred, then reformed, still recognizable as human, but with subtle wrongness. Eyes too large and too dark, mouths that opened too wide, limbs that bent at impossible angles. "You activated the threshold," Volkov's double said, gesturing to the mark on Volkov's palm. "You opened the way between worlds, and now we will walk through." "Into our world?" Volkov asked, though he already knew the answer. "Into all worlds," the creature replied. "We have been confined to the spaces between realities for too long, watching, learning, but never experiencing. Now we will live as you live, feel as you feel, be as you are." "And what happens to us?" Ivanov demanded. His duplicate smiled a terrible expression that stretched its face unnaturally. "You will join the watching, as all humans eventually will." The creatures began to advance, moving with that same unnatural fluidity they'd witnessed in the cave. Volkov and his men backed toward the edge of the ledge, the long drop behind them. "We can't let them through," Volkov said quietly to his companions. "Whatever happens, they can't be allowed to reach our world." Sokolov nodded grimly. "What's the plan, Captain?" Volkov looked down at the symbol on his palm, which was glowing brighter now, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. I think I can close the threshold, but I need to get back to the original chamber, to the metal plate." "How?" Ivanov asked. "The tunnels keep changing." Volkov studied his duplicate, which was watching him with an expression of curious amusement. "They know the way. They can move between the spaces at will. So we make them take us back," Sokolov realized. "Exactly." Volkov stepped forward, addressing his doppelganger directly. "You want to understand what it means to be human, to experience our reality." The creature tilted its head, intrigued. "Then you need to understand sacrifice," Volkov said. "You need to understand choice." "Explain," the duplicate demanded. "Take us back to the threshold chamber," Volkov proposed. "Let me show you what it truly means to be human." The creatures conferred among themselves, speaking in that strange language of whispers and clicks. Finally, Volkov's duplicate turned back to him. "We accept," it said. "We will take you to the threshold, and there you will show us this sacrifice." The world around them began to dissolve, the mountain scenery melting away like wax under a flame. The sky folded in on itself, the ground beneath their feet became transparent, and for a dizzying moment, they were falling through layers of reality, glimpses of other places, other times flashing past them. Then they were back in the original chamber, standing around the metal plate embedded in the floor. Their unconscious comrades remained where they'd left them, partially merged with the stone walls and floor. "Now the duplicate," Volkov said, "show us this human concept of sacrifice." Volkov looked at Sokolov and Ivanov, a silent message passing between them. They understood what needed to be done. Human sacrifice, Volkov began, kneeling beside the metal plate, isn't about death. It's about choice, about being willing to give up everything for something greater than yourself. As he spoke, he placed his marked palm flat against the plate. The contact sent that now familiar jolt of energy through him, but this time he didn't resist it. He let it flow through him, channel through him. "What are you doing?" his duplicate demanded, suddenly alert to the danger. "Closing the door," Volkov replied through gritted teeth. The symbols on the plate began to glow, spreading outward in a spiral pattern. But instead of the blue-green light they'd seen before, this time the glow was red-gold, like the heart of a forge. The duplicates shrieked a sound that pierced through bone and sanity. They rushed forward, their forms distorting as they moved, reaching for Volkov with too many limbs. Sokolov and Ivanov intercepted them, grappling with the creatures despite the danger. They couldn't hope to overpower them, but they could buy Volkov the time he needed. The chamber began to shake, dust and small stones raining down from above. The symbols on the walls flared with intense light, then began to crack, fissures spreading across the stone surface. "What have you done?" Volkov's duplicate screamed, its voice no longer human, but a cacophony of overlapping tones. "What humans do best," Volkov replied, his voice strained with effort. "Adapt, survive, and when necessary, fight back." The metal plate beneath his hand began to crack, fractures spreading outward from the center. The energy flowing through Volkov intensified, becoming almost unbearable. He could feel himself being pulled in two directions, part of him anchored to this reality, part being drawn into the void beyond. Captain Sokolov called, his voice seeming to come from very far away. "There's an opening. Above us." Volkov looked up through watering eyes. A shaft of natural light cut through the chaos, a tunnel leading upward, toward the surface. Toward escape. "Go," he ordered. "I'll hold them here." "Not without you," Ivanov shouted, breaking free from his duplicate to rush to Volkov's side. "That's an order," Private Volkov barked. "Someone has to tell them what happened here. What's still happening?" After a moment of hesitation, Ivanov nodded grimly. He grabbed Sokolov, who was still struggling with his duplicate, and together they made for the opening, scrambling up the rough stone toward the light. Alone now, Volkov turned his full attention to the plate. The duplicates surrounded him, their forms flickering between human disguises and their true appearance, elongated limbs, too many joints, faces that were collections of sensory organs arranged in impossible configurations. "You cannot stop what has already begun," Volkov's duplicate said, its voice distorted by something inhuman underneath. "We have always been here. We will always find a way through." "Not this way," Volkov gritted out. "Not through me." With a final surge of will, he channeled everything he had into the plate. The metal shattered beneath his palm, fragments exploding outward with concussive force. The chamber itself began to fold inward, reality collapsing around the broken threshold. The watchers screamed, their forms unraveling as the dimensional tear began to seal itself. Volkov felt himself being pulled upward, away from the implosion, as if carried by invisible hands. His last glimpse of the chamber was of the watchers reaching for him with desperate, grasping limbs, before darkness engulfed everything. When Volkov opened his eyes, he was lying on his back, staring up at a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The sun was warm on his face, the air fresh and clean in his lungs. He could hear birds singing, wind rustling through grass. Captain Sokolov's face appeared above him, concern etched into his features. "Can you hear me?" Volkov nodded weakly, letting Sokolov and Ivanov help him to a sitting position. They were on the mountainside, some distance from the cave entrance. Below them, the valley stretched out, peaceful and ordinary in the morning light. "Did we make it?" Sokolov asked, his voice hushed with disbelief. "Are we really out?" Volkov looked down at his palm. The symbol was still there, but faded now, like an old scar rather than a fresh brand. "I think so," he said cautiously. "I sealed the threshold. The watchers can't use it to cross over anymore." "What about the others?" Ivanov asked. "Kuznetsov, Leonov, the rest." Volkov shook his head grimly. "I don't think they're coming back. They were already changed, becoming part of the cave itself." "And the duplicates?" Sokolov pressed. "The ones that looked like us. Trapped." "I hope," Volkov replied. "At least for now." They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. The ordeal had left them physically and mentally exhausted, but they were alive in themselves, as far as they could tell. "We should head back to base," Volkov finally said, struggling to his feet. "Report what happened." "Who's going to believe us?" Ivanov asked bitterly. "Time distortions? Creatures that mimic humans? They'll have us committed." "We have to try," Volkov insisted. "Whatever was in that cave, it's been there for thousands of years. And I don't think it's the only one of its kind. There could be more thresholds, more watchers trying to break through." They began the long descent toward base camp, each step taking them further from the cave but not from the knowledge they carried. Volkov knew they would be debriefed, questioned, probably deemed unstable or delusional. The official report would cite a cave-in, equipment malfunction, perhaps even insurgent activity to explain the missing men. The truth would be buried, as it always was, but not forgotten. Not by them. As they walked, Sokolov suddenly stopped, looking back at the mountain with a troubled expression. "Do you hear that?" Volkov and Ivanov paused, listening. At first there was nothing but the wind. Then, faintly, a whisper seemed to carry on the breeze, words just at the edge of comprehension, familiar yet alien. "We see you still. We are patient. We will find another way." "Just the wind," Volkov said, though he didn't believe it himself. "Keep moving." They continued downward, the whispers fading but never quite disappearing. As they neared the valley floor, they spotted movement ahead, a Soviet patrol, moving cautiously up the trail toward them. "Our people," Ivanov said with relief. They must have sent a search party. But as the patrol drew closer, Volkov felt a creeping unease. Something about the way the soldiers moved was off, too fluid, too coordinated. And when the patrol leader raised his binoculars to observe them, his movements were just a fraction too smooth. "Wait," Volkov said quietly, holding out an arm to stop his companions. "Something's wrong." "What is it?" Sokolov asked, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon. "Look at them," Volkov whispered. "Really look." The patrol had stopped about 100 meters away, forming a perfect line across the trail. Too perfect. They stood motionless, watching, waiting. "Could be standard procedure," Ivanov suggested hopefully. "They might not recognize us." But Volkov knew better. As they watched, the patrol leader smiled a wide, empty expression that never reached his eyes. Then he raised his hand in greeting, the movement slightly too fluid, the joints bending at subtly wrong angles. "It's them," Volkov breathed. "The Watchers. They found another way through." "How?" Sokolov demanded. "You sealed the threshold." "That threshold," Volkov corrected grimly. "But they said they've been watching us for thousands of years. There must be other entry points, other caves." "So what do we do?" Ivanov asked, his voice tight with renewed fear. Volkov studied the patrol, which continued to watch them with that eerie stillness. Then he looked down at the symbol on his palm, which had begun to tingle faintly. "We can't go back that way," he decided. "We'll have to find another route to base camp." And then what? Sokolov pressed. "Then we warn whoever will listen," Volkov said. "And we watch. We look for the signs, people moving wrong, speaking wrong. The little details that give them away. A war no one else knows we're fighting," Ivanov murmured. "Exactly." They turned away from the trail, heading into the rugged terrain to the east. The false patrol made no move to follow them, but Volkov could feel their eyes on his back, patient, calculating, inhuman. As they picked their way through the rocky landscape, Volkov couldn't shake the feeling that their escape had been too easy. The Watchers had been studying humans for millennia. They were patient, methodical. Would they really let 3 witnesses simply walk away? Unless, of course, that was part of their plan all along. Volkov glanced at Sokolov and Ivanov, studying them carefully. They looked like themselves, moved like themselves, spoke like themselves. But after what they'd experienced, could he ever be certain? Could he even be certain about himself? The symbol on his palm tingled again, a quiet reminder of what waited in the darkness between worlds. And as they continued their journey toward what they hoped was safety, Volkov couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not from behind, but from within. Perhaps the most terrifying possibility of all was that they hadn't escaped at all. That this apparent freedom was just another layer of the Watchers' deception. Another test, another observation. Another way to learn what it meant to be human. The journey back to base camp took them 3 days. 3 days of skirting Soviet patrols they couldn't trust, of sleeping in shifts with weapons ready, of jumping at shadows and whispers that might or might not have been the wind. By the time the familiar outlines of the camp appeared in the valley below, they were exhausted, paranoid, and no longer certain of anything, least of all their own perceptions. "Standard approach?" Sokolov asked as they surveyed the camp from a ridge overlooking the valley. Volkov studied the activity below through his binoculars. Everything looked normal: soldiers moving between tents, vehicles being serviced, the routine operations of a military outpost. But after what they'd seen, normal meant nothing. "No," he decided. "We observe first. I want to be sure." They spent hours watching the camp, looking for any sign that the Watchers had infiltrated it. Any movement that seemed too fluid, any behavior that didn't match standard Soviet military protocol. But everything appeared ordinary. "Maybe we're being paranoid," Ivanov suggested as dusk approached. "Maybe the Watchers haven't reached the camp yet. Or maybe they're better at hiding than we think," Volkov countered. "We need to get closer." They approached under cover of darkness, using the skills that had kept them alive through years of covert operations. The camp's perimeter was guarded, but the sentries were positioned predictably. They slipped past the outer defenses without difficulty, making their way to the command center at the heart of the compound. Outside the commander's tent, they paused, listening to the voices within. 3 weeks since they disappeared came the voice of Colonel Baranov, the base commander. "Moscow is demanding answers. The search parties found nothing." "With respect, Colonel," another voice replied, "we've combed those mountains. If Volkov and his team were still alive, we would have found some trace." "Then find me bodies," Baranov snapped. I'm not declaring them lost without evidence. Volkov exchanged glances with Sokolov and Ivanov. The conversation sounded genuine, the frustration in Baranov's voice, the weariness in his subordinate's response. 3 weeks, Sokolov whispered. But it's only been days since we entered the cave. Time distortion, Volkov reminded him. Remember our watches. They retreated to a shadowy area between supply tents to confer. It sounds like they're really looking for us, Ivanov said. Not like them. Maybe, Volkov conceded. But we need to be sure, he thought for a moment, then nodded to himself. There's one way to test them. The plan was simple. Sokolov would approach the camp openly, claiming to be the sole survivor of their mission. He would report that Volkov and Ivanov had died in a cave-in. Meanwhile, Volkov and Ivanov would observe the camp's reaction. If they were genuine, they would follow standard protocols: medical examination, debriefing, communications with headquarters. Be careful, Volkov told Sokolov. At the first sign something's wrong, get out. Sokolov nodded grimly. And if I don't come back? Then we know, Volkov replied. And we find another way. They watched as Sokolov approached the main gate, hands raised to show he was unarmed. The guards reacted with surprise, then urgency, surrounding him and escorting him quickly into the camp. One ran toward the command center, presumably to alert Colonel Baranov. For the next several hours, Volkov and Ivanov observed from their hiding place. The camp erupted into activity, medical personnel rushing to the infirmary, officers gathering at the command center, radio operators making contact with headquarters. All standard procedure for the recovery of a missing soldier. It looks genuine, Iva whispered. They're following protocol exactly. Do exactly, Volkov wondered aloud. The Watchers studied us. They would know our procedures. As night deepened, they continued their vigil. Sokolov was taken to the infirmary, then to the command center for debriefing. Eventually, he was escorted to the officers' quarters, presumably to rest. I'm going in, Volkov decided. I need to speak with him. That's too risky, Ivanov protested. If they are Watchers, then we're already compromised, Volkov finished. But I don't think they are. This feels real. Using the cover of a supply delivery, Volkov slipped into the camp, making his way to the officers' quarters. He found Sokolov alone in a small room, sitting on the edge of a cot, staring at his hands. Sokolov, Volkov whispered from the doorway. The lieutenant's head snapped up, relief washing over his face. Captain, you're all right. What happened? Are they genuine? Sokolov nodded. As far as I can tell, they followed every protocol. The doctor examined me thoroughly, blood tests, reflexes, the works. Colonel Baranov debriefed me himself. They asked about you and Ivanov. I told them what we agreed. And they believed you. I think so. They're organizing recovery teams to retrieve your bodies tomorrow. Volkov considered this information. Everything pointed to the camp being untouched by the Watchers. But after everything they'd experienced, could they really trust appearances? There's one more test, Volkov said, approaching Sokolov. Give me your hand. Sokolov extended his right hand without hesitation. Volkov took it, turning it palm up. The skin was unmarked, no symbol, no scar. Now the other one. Meow. Sokolov's left palm was similarly unmarked. Volkov felt a weight lift from his shoulders. If Sokolov had been replaced by a Watcher, the creature would likely bear the same mark that Volkov carried, the symbol of the threshold. We're clear, Volkov decided. Get Ivanov. Tell Colonel Baranov the truth, or as much of it as he'll believe. And you, Captain. Volkov looked down at his marked palm. There's something I need to do first. While Sokolov retrieved Ivanov, Volkov made his way to the communications center. The night shift operator was surprised to see him, but too junior to question a captain's orders. Volkov sent an encrypted message to Moscow, addressed to a specific department that handled unusual phenomena, a department whose existence was officially denied but which Volkov knew existed from previous encounters with the unexplained. The message was brief: threshold discovered in Paktia province. Non-human entities attempting incursion. Recommend immediate containment. Full report to follow. Captain M. Volkov, 40th Army Special Reconnaissance. Whether anyone would believe him was another matter entirely. But he had to try. By morning, the camp was buzzing with the news of their return. Colonel Baranov, after initially dismissing their account as stress-induced hallucination, became more receptive when all three survivors told the same impossible story. The discovery of the symbol on Volkov's palm, a mark that defied medical explanation, further convinced him that something extraordinary had occurred. Moscow is sending a special team, Baranov informed them in his office. Scientists, they say. They'll be here within 48 hours. Scientists won't be enough, Volkov warned. Whatever was in that cave, it's ancient and intelligent, and I don't think we've seen the last of it. What would you suggest? Captain Baranov asked, his tone making it clear he still harbored doubts. Seal the cave, Volkov said without hesitation. Permanently, use explosives to collapse the entire mountainside if necessary. That's a bit extreme, don't you think? Colonel, with respect, you weren't there. You didn't see what these things can do. They can mimic us perfectly. They can manipulate time and space. If they find another way through. Baranov studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll recommend it to Moscow, but the final decision won't be mine. Make them understand the urgency, Volkov pressed. Every moment that cave remains open is a danger to everyone. After the meeting, Volkov found himself drawn to the camp's perimeter, staring up at the mountains where the cave awaited. The symbol on his palm tingled faintly, as if responding to its proximity. Captain Ivanov's voice came from behind him. Sokolov and I were wondering, what happens now? Volkov turned to face his subordinate. The young private looked different, somehow older, harder, the innocence in his eyes replaced by awareness that would never fully disappear. Now we wait, Volkov replied. Moscow will send their team. They'll investigate. Maybe they'll believe us. Maybe they won't. And if they don't seal the cave. Volkov's expression darkened. Then we'll have to do it ourselves. That night, Volkov dreamed of the cave again. In his dream, he stood before the metal plate, the symbols glowing around him. But this time, he wasn't alone. His duplicate stood opposite him, wearing his face but with eyes that were pools of darkness. You think you've won, the duplicate said, its voice echoing strangely. You think you've escaped. I sealed the threshold, Volkov replied. You can't follow us. The duplicate smiled, that terrible, too wide smile that no human face should be able to make. We don't need to follow. We're already there. What do you mean? The mark you carry, the duplicate gestured to Volkov's palm. It's not just a symbol, it's a seed, a connection. Through you, we see your world. Through you, we will enter. Volkov looked down at his palm in horror. The symbol was glowing brighter now, the lines extending up his wrist, spreading across his skin like a web of light. No, he whispered. I won't let you use me. You already have, the duplicate said. Every time you sleep, every time your guard drops, we are there in the corners of your mind, watching, learning, growing stronger. Volkov woke with a gasp, his body drenched in cold sweat. The room was dark, silent except for his ragged breathing. He looked down at his palm. The symbol was glowing faintly, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. It hadn't been just a dream. Moving quietly so as not to wake the others in the officers' quarters, Volkov dressed and slipped outside. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. The mountains loomed in the distance, dark and forbidding. He made his way to the armory, using his authority as captain to sign out equipment, explosives, detonators, timers. Enough to collapse a cave entrance, if placed correctly. Planning a little demolition, Captain asked the armory sergeant, eyeing the equipment. Training exercise, Volkov replied smoothly. Colonel's orders. The sergeant nodded, accepting the explanation without question. Volkov felt a twinge of guilt at the lie, but pushed it aside. Some actions had to be taken outside the chain of command. Some threats couldn't wait for bureaucracy. He was preparing to leave when a voice spoke from the shadows. You're going back, aren't you? Volkov turned to find Sokolov and Ivanov watching him, both fully dressed and equipped for the field. This isn't your responsibility, Volkov told them. I can handle it alone. With respect, Captain Sokolov replied. We were there too. We saw what those things can do. This is our fight as much as yours. Ivanov nodded in agreement. Besides, you'll need help placing the charges. Volkov studied them for a moment, then nodded. All right, but we do this quickly and quietly. In and out before dawn. They left the camp under cover of darkness, using a maintenance vehicle to cover the first part of their journey. The rest they would do on foot, approaching the cave from an angle that would keep them hidden from any patrols or observation posts. As they drove through the night, Volkov briefed them on his plan. We placed charges at key structural points around the entrance. When they detonate, the entire facade should collapse, sealing the cave permanently. And if there are other entrances, Sokolov asked. Then we find them, Volkov said grimly, and seal them too. They reached the base of the mountain just before midnight, continuing on foot up the treacherous slopes. The journey was arduous, but their determination drove them forward. By the time they approached the cave entrance, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. The cave mouth yawned before them, dark and forbidding. The perfect arch seemed to watch them, as if aware of their intentions. It looks different, Ivanov noted, studying the entrance. He was right. The proportions seemed wrong somehow, the arch higher and wider than Volkov remembered, and the stone around it was darker, the strange striations more pronounced. It's changing, Volkov realized. Adapting. All the more reason to seal it now, Sokolov said, already unpacking the explosives. They worked quickly, placing charges at strategic points around the entrance and along the rock face above it. Volkov calculated the detonation sequence carefully. Each explosion would trigger the next, creating a cascading collapse that would bury the entrance under thousands of tons of rock. As they worked, Volkov noticed the symbol on his palm glowing brighter, pulsing more rapidly. The air around the cave entrance seemed to thicken, becoming harder to breathe. And from deep within the darkness came sounds, not quite voices, but something similar, whispers that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the mind. "We see you, time-bound ones. Your efforts are futile. The threshold cannot be closed. We are already among you." "Ignore it," Volkov told the others, who had also heard the whispers. "Focus on the task." They completed their work just as the sun crested the eastern mountains, bathing the valley below in golden light. The charges were set, the detonators connected, the timer ready. 5 minutes, Volkov said, activating the timer. "That gives us enough time to reach a safe distance." They retreated down the slope, taking cover behind a massive boulder several hundred meters from the cave entrance. As they waited for the detonation, Volkov found himself staring at the symbol on his palm. It was glowing brighter than ever, the light visible even in the morning sun. "Captain Sokolov said quietly, your hand." Volkov looked up to find both Sokolov and Ivanov watching him with concern. "It's nothing," he assured them, "just a reaction to proximity to the cave." But he knew it was more than that. The symbol was a connection, a tether binding him to the Watchers, and as long as he carried it, they would have a way to reach him, to influence him, perhaps even to use him as a gateway. The timer reached 0. The first explosion rocked the mountainside, followed quickly by the second, then the third. The carefully planned sequence worked perfectly, each blast triggering the next in a symphony of destruction. The cave entrance collapsed in a cloud of dust and debris, rocks tumbling down to fill the opening completely. When the dust settled, there was no sign the cave had ever existed, just a massive pile of rubble where the entrance had been. "It's done," Ivanov breathed, relief evident in his voice. "Is it?" Volkov wondered aloud, looking down at his palm. The symbol's glow had dimmed but not disappeared entirely. They made their way back to the vehicle, the morning sun warming their backs. The mountain behind them stood silent, its secret once again buried beneath tons of rock. But as they drove away, Volkov couldn't shake the feeling that they had only delayed the inevitable. The Watchers had been patient for millennia. They would be patient again, and next time they might choose a different threshold, a different key, a different vessel. As they approached the camp, Volkov made a decision. He would request a transfer back to Moscow, citing psychological stress from the mission. There, he would seek out the department that handled the unexplained. He would tell them everything, show them the mark he carried. Perhaps they would know how to remove it, how to sever his connection to the Watchers permanently. And if not, well, there were other options, more permanent solutions. Because one thing was certain, he would not be the gateway that allowed those things into his world. The camp came into view, soldiers going about their morning routines, unaware of the threat that had nearly reached them, unaware that the 3 men returning to them had glimpsed something that defied human understanding. "What do we tell them?" Sokolov asked as they approached the gate. "As much of the truth as they'll believe," Volkov replied. "And nothing about this," he held up his marked palm. "And if Moscow sends their team, if they want to study the cave, they'll find nothing but rubble," Volkov said with finality. Some secrets are better left buried. As they passed through the gate, returning to the world of order and routine, Volkov cast one last glance back at the mountains. For a moment, just a moment, he thought he saw something moving against the distant peaks. A distortion in the air, like heat shimmer, but more defined. A doorway of light, opening where none should exist. Then it was gone, and there was only the wind and the mountains and the rising sun. But the symbol on his palm pulsed once, as if in recognition, and Volkov knew with cold certainty that their encounter with the Watchers was far from over. Moscow, February 1983. Snow fell in thick, lazy flakes outside the window of Department 13, a nondescript building in a nondescript part of the city. Inside, Captain Mikhail Volkov sat across from Colonel Dmitry Yusupov, the weathered file on the desk between them stamped with the highest security classification. "Your report makes 4. Interesting reading," Captain Yusupov said, his tone carefully neutral. His eyes, however, betrayed his interest, sharp and calculating behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Every word is true," Colonel Volkov replied. The 2 months since Afghanistan had done little to fade the memories. If anything, distance had brought clarity, the horror crystallizing into something more defined, more certain. "I don't doubt your sincerity," Yusupov said, lighting a cigarette. The smoke curled between them like a living thing. "What concerns me is the lack of physical evidence. The cave destroyed, your comrades conveniently unable to corroborate certain details. Lieutenant Sokolov and Private Ivanov confirmed everything in their debriefings," Volkov pointed out. "Everything they witnessed," Yusupov corrected. "But according to your own account, you alone experienced the final confrontation with these Watchers. You alone bear this mark," he gestured to Volkov's gloved hand. Slowly, deliberately, Volkov removed the leather glove he'd taken to wearing. The symbol remained on his palm, faded to a silvery scar tissue, but still unmistakable, the intricate pattern of lines and curves forming a spiral surrounded by angular glyphs. "Our medical team has no explanation for this," Yusupov admitted, studying the mark with clinical interest. "Nor for the unusual brain activity we detected during your examinations." "Brain activity?" Volkov asked, feeling a cold knot form in his stomach. Yusupov opened the file, removing several sheets of paper covered in jagged lines, EEG readings. "During REM sleep, your brain shows patterns we've never seen before. Areas activating that shouldn't be active. Energy signatures that defy conventional understanding." "The dreams," Volkov murmured. They had continued since his return, vivid nightmares where he walked through endless cave systems, pursued by shadows that wore familiar faces. Dreams where he stood before mirrors that showed not his reflection but something else looking back, wearing his features like an ill-fitting mask. "You believe these entities are still in contact with you," Yusupov stated. "Not a question. I know they are," Volkov replied. "They said the mark was a connection. A seed. And yet you haven't exhibited any unusual behavior. No personality changes, no lapses in memory, no signs of outside influence." "Not that I'm aware of," Volkov conceded. "But they're patient. They think in terms of centuries, millennia. Whatever they're planning, they're in no hurry." Yusupov leaned back, exhaling a cloud of smoke toward the ceiling. "You understand my position, Captain. I head a department tasked with investigating phenomena that might have military applications. Psychic research, unexplained events, anomalous discoveries. But even in my division, there are limits to what I can pursue without tangible results." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that while I find your account compelling, I need more than one man's testimony and an unexplained scar. I need evidence that these Watchers pose a genuine threat to state security." Volkov felt a surge of frustration. They can mimic humans perfectly. They exist outside normal time. They've been infiltrating our world for who knows how long. What more evidence do you need? "The kind that would convince my superiors to allocate resources," Yusupov replied calmly. "The kind that would justify the expedition I believe we need to mount." "Expedition?" Volkov repeated, suddenly alert. "You want to go back there?" "Not just there," Yusupov said, removing a map from the file. "According to our research, there are similar cave systems throughout the region. Sites with unusual properties, avoided by locals, associated with folklore about disappearances and time distortions." He pointed to several locations marked in red, here in the Urals, here in Siberia, here in the Caucasus, and most interestingly, here his finger tapped a spot in Kazakhstan, where 3 geological survey teams have vanished in the past decade. "You think they're all thresholds?" Volkov realized. "Doorways for the Watchers." "I think they warrant investigation," Yusupov corrected. and I think you're uniquely qualified to lead such investigations." Volkov stared at him in disbelief. "You want me to go back? After everything I've told you?" "Precisely because of everything you've told me," Yusupov said. "You've encountered these entities and survived. You bear their mark but have resisted their influence. Who better to recognize the signs of their presence? And if I refuse?" Yusupov's expression hardened slightly. "Then I file my report recommending no further action. Your account is classified, archived, and forgotten. You return to regular duty with a notation in your file about stress-induced hallucinations. And if these watchers are real, they continue their work unimpeded." The manipulation was obvious but effective. Volkov knew he couldn't walk away, not if there was even a chance that what he'd experienced in Afghanistan was happening elsewhere. "When would this expedition begin?" he asked finally. "As soon as I can secure approval," Yusupov replied, "which your cooperation would greatly facilitate." Volkov considered his options. He could refuse, try to forget what he'd seen, what he knew. But the mark on his palm was a constant reminder that forgetting wasn't possible. The watchers had touched him, changed him, and if they were opening other doorways, "I'll do it," he decided. "But I want Sokolov and Ivanov with me. And I want your word that if we find evidence of these entities, you'll take decisive action. No studies, no attempts to communicate or control them, just containment and eradication." Yusupov studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Agreed. Though I should warn you, Lieutenant Sokolov has already volunteered. He came to us 3 weeks ago, reporting unusual dreams. Dreams of caves and mirrors and creatures wearing human faces." Volkov felt the cold knot in his stomach tighten. "And Ivanov?" "We haven't located him yet," Yusupov admitted. "After your return from Afghanistan, he requested transfer to a remote outpost in Siberia. His commanding officer reports he's become increasingly withdrawn, speaking of voices in the walls and figures that watch him from reflective surfaces. They're affecting all of us," Volkov said grimly. "The exposure in the cave changed something in us, made us receptive to them." "All the more reason to understand what we're dealing with," Yusupov said, closing the file. "Report back tomorrow at 0800. We'll begin preparation for the first expedition." As Volkov left the building, snow swirling around him in the gathering dusk, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Not by Soviet intelligence, though that was certainly happening, but by something else. Something that saw through eyes that weren't quite human, that existed in the spaces between moments. In his apartment that night, Volkov stood before the bathroom mirror, studying his reflection with wary attention. His face looked the same weathered features. The same gray eyes, the same short cropped hair now showing touches of silver at the temples. But was it really him looking back? The mark on his palm pulsed faintly, reflected in the mirror. But when Volkov looked down at his actual hand, the symbol was dormant, the silvery scar tissue inert. Only in the reflection did it glow. "I know you're watching," he said to the mirror. "I know you're waiting." His reflection smiled a smile Volkov himself wasn't making. Its lips moved, forming words that emerged as whispers in his mind, rather than sounds in the air. "We are patient, time-bound one. We have always been patient, but the waiting nears its end." The reflection's eyes darkened, the pupils expanding until they consumed the iris, the whites, until there were only pools of blackness staring back at him. "You opened one door. Others will open more. The threshold between worlds grows thinner. Soon we will no longer need doors at all." Volkov backed away from the mirror, his heart pounding. The reflection didn't follow his movement, it remained standing there, watching him with those bottomless black eyes. "We will wear your world, time-bound one. We will wear your faces, your lives, your moments, and you will never know the difference." With a surge of anger, Volkov grabbed a heavy ashtray from the counter and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered, fragments scattering across the bathroom floor. In each shard, his reflection stared back normal now, eyes wide with shock, face pale with fear. He sank to the floor, back against the wall, surrounded by broken glass. The mark on his palm burned, a dull, persistent ache that reached up his arm and into his chest. They were coming. Not just through him, but through others who had been marked, changed. Sokolov with his dreams. Ivanov hearing voices in the walls. How many more were there? How many thresholds had been activated? And most terrifying of all, what if they were already here? What if the colonel, with his keen interest and his talk of expeditions, wasn't Yusupov at all but something wearing his face, using his position to find more thresholds, open more doorways? Volkov knew he would go on the expedition. He would search for evidence, for answers, for ways to fight back. But as he sat amid the shattered mirror, each fragment reflecting a piece of himself that no longer felt entirely his own, he couldn't escape the growing certainty that it was already too late. The Watchers had been patient for millennia. They had waited in the darkness between worlds, observing, learning, planning. And now, finally, the waiting was coming to an end. The threshold between worlds was opening. And nothing, not demolished caves, not classified reports, not even the desperate efforts of those few who knew the truth would be enough to close it again. In the broken shards of mirror, Volkov's fractured reflection smiled in unison, a smile that wasn't his own. "We see you, time-bound one. We have always seen you. And soon, we will be you."